This video is brought to you by Twitter. No, not because of any sponsorship, but because Twitter exists, and every day it makes my life into an unbearable hellscape of other people's bad takes, wrong opinions, and poor reasoning skills. On the 18th of February, 2021, the website Jezebel uploaded an article by one of their staff writers, Shannon Malero, entitled "Who Forgot to Invite Chun-Li to the Mortal Kombat?", which was, seemingly, an article about the new Mortal Kombat film, which will be premiering on HBO Max at some point in the near future. Now, some of you may be more familiar with Mortal Kombat or Chun-Li than yours truly, but for those of you who are equally ignorant, let me inform you that Chun-Li does not, nor has she ever, appeared in any version of Mortal Kombat. Because of this fact, those people on Twitter who apparently care about these things read this headline and, to put it lightly, lost their collective. There were screenshots, there were retweets, there were threads, there were endless replies, and most of those were to the effect of a hysterical, "How could any self-respecting publication have allowed such a thing to happen?" with the side of, "I can't believe they're leaving this article up. Can you believe how much shame they must feel at the egg on their face that this situation has become?" A vanishingly few number of people waded into this fray to point out that actually this was a piece of satire and not, in fact, a serious piece of journalism, in that, no, the author wasn't a stupid know-nothing woman who doesn't even know how to do a Google. Perhaps it is just that the people who realized it was a piece of satire were able to move on with their lives and thus did not take to Twitter en masse to express their relaxed response to a piece of writing less than 300 words long on a subject which is, to put it mildly, not that important. But in the replies, there was a vocal majority who were unable to contain themselves. And unfortunately, the longer I thought about these people and their completely disproportionate response to a piece of troll bait, the angrier I got. And now, here we are. This completely disproportionate video essay response will be composed of several parts. One will be a sentence-by-sentence close reading deconstruction of the article itself, where we will perform the critical close reading, which apparently people have needed help with. And in doing so, we will realize that actually this was a very carefully and expertly composed piece of satirical writing. Then we will take a look at the responses to the article and the ways in which they are both an important part of what the article was trying to accomplish, and the dangerous lines of logic that were touted by a variety of individuals, which reveal some serious failures on the part of those individuals to understand the forms and functions of both journalism and cultural criticism, not to mention their inability to perform the basic deductive reasoning required to successfully evaluate a piece of writing. I'm going to take you through this article, sentence by sentence, in hopes of convincing you that not only is this an impressively committed piece of trolling, but was actually a finely crafted, carefully put together piece of satirical authorship. We open with a bang. "Cinema is back, baby, and in a big way. Forget the auteur films of awards season where two people stand at the edge of a cliff somewhere in Great Britain, pining for each other, but never finding a way to make their relationship work. There's a new Mortal Kombat hitting HBO Max, and life is f***ing good. Film, cinema, the movies have, like many other public events, suffered pretty seriously with the pandemic. This could just be the opening volley of an action flick enthusiast gearing up for the next exciting, reconstituted intellectual property into film transposition. But there are hints that maybe that isn't the case. First of all, the use of the term cinema is a little dubious next to Mortal Kombat, even if Mortal Kombat is appearing in live action moving picture format, right? And bringing up auteur cinema with an explicit, if veiled, crack about what I assume to be one film in particular puts me on alert to pay attention to what's going on here, because I doubt all is as it first appears. Then we get Scorsese is shaking in his oversized spectacles, watching, probably for the 15th time, the trailer for the latest film version that brings to life the gore of the original video game. Now, I get the impression that a lot of the people who read this article on Jezebel about the new Mortal Kombat movie and decided to tweet about it aren't subscribed to Harper's Magazine. No shade. I usually only remember that Harper's exists when I see it in the stack of magazines in my parents' bathroom. But for those of you who don't know, in the March 2021 issue of Harper's, Martin Scorsese published an essay entitled Il Maestro, with the subtitle Federico Fellini and the Lost Magic of Cinema. In it, he talks about how we're losing a lot of what makes cinema good and what makes it an art form on par with great works of literature and the quote-unquote fine arts. Now, regardless of whether or not you agree with Scorsese's take on the state of film today, and or whether or not you think he's an elitist douche nozzle out of touch with the people who cannot understand the overwhelming cultural value of the MCU, is immaterial. What matters is that this is our first hint that this article isn't about Mortal Kombat. This is an article that is thinking about fan culture, the state of film and art criticism, and how we collectively, especially on the internet, respond to and engage with these traditions. Because this article knows that Mortal Kombat is exactly the kind of movie Scorsese has been talking about, and exactly how those comments have been received. Now, let's move on. The next sentence. The trailer itself is worthy of at least 2 Oscars for its special effects and stunt coordination, specifically for the preview of a scene where Sub-Zero turns his enemy's blood into a knife. What? Again, here, the author deftly and precisely targets her language. We have the trailer, not usually the primary source for criticism of quote-unquote auteur films, with the exception of the guys who used to do the Seen Unseen movie reviews. It's a fantastic podcast. Link will be below. She mentions the Oscars, the most recognized and highly prized of all cinematic awards, with the possible exception of the Cannes Palme d'Or, But those guys are French, so really who cares what they think? And we have blood turning into a knife in conjunction with arguably the most well-recognized character name from Mortal Kombat. And Sub-Zero does, in fact, state his name for the camera. So even the most ignorant nobody would at least know that Sub-Zero was the guy with the freezy temperature skills, and, you know, he is arguably the most famous Mortal Kombat character, and I say that purely as someone who, again, does not know anything about Mortal Kombat. But I have at least heard of Sub-Zero. But the point is, we're mixing Scorsese and the Oscars with what can perhaps generously be described as a fan service film. You know, much like the 2018 Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson vehicle Rampage, another arcade game to film production, or the 2012 largely erased from public consciousness board game to film Battleship. The idea that Mortal Kombat has enough narrative material to mine for a feature-length film, or arguably even the emotional depth to transform an audience, is kind of a stretch. Obviously, I don't think that this means that the new Mortal Kombat film, or any prior iteration of the IP, is bad, or even that it can't have some deeper significance. You know, a lot of these movies do ultimately end up being able to communicate little things, be they about race or gender or class or, you know, international relations. For example, the one thing we do know is that the first person you see get killed in the trailer for this new movie is a black guy. So I'm not, you know, holding out hope that this movie's gonna clear the baseline of don't kill the black guy first. And it's not clear to me that this movie is gonna pass the Bechdel test either. But that, you know, doesn't mean that you can't get something out of it. I like a lot of bad movies. I like a lot of dumb movies. I unironically enjoy Transformers. Like, I don't know what to tell you. Well, up to a point. But anyway. I do think that the point Miss Malero is making here is that Mortal Kombat is, in its purest and most laudable form, a spectacle. It's exactly the kind of thing Scorsese, that titanic figure of at least American auteur cinema, is speaking out against. Now here, a little before the halfway point, is where the big, obvious mistake occurs. It reads, "But, being the astute film critic that I am, I immediately clocked a glaring error in the film. Where, in all the realms, is Chun-Li?" Now here we have questions both of tone to unpack, but also one of the many hints that the author is quite possibly not as ignorant as she first appears. The idea of someone declaring themselves an astute film critic in this way and being serious about it is about as likely as putting your professional qualifications down as having a, quote, master's degree from video game school, unquote. But more than merely what one would hope comes across as bombastic hyperbole telegraphing its own lack of sincerity, we have the word realms. Now, I had to do some sleuthing to double check this because, as previously stated, I don't know anything about Mortal Kombat. So I did some research. Realms is the term used for the different dimensions, planes of existence, space-time continua, whatever, that contain the different worlds the fighters in Mortal Kombat hail from. More specifically, the word realms is never used in the trailer for the new Mortal Kombat movie. And, of course, realms isn't used in the Street Fighter universe at all. This indicates that whatever else we may believe about the author, she is at least familiar enough with the lore of Mortal Kombat to be able to accurately reference its cosmology. Something which a true casual fan, or fully ignorant individual like myself, would be unlikely to do. At least, neither this well nor this easily. But let's move on. If there is a battle for the fate of the Earth, then don't we need all of the greatest warriors gathered, which would include Chun-Li and her spinning bird kick that can knock a man's head clean off? This is a fairly innocuous line. The detail is such that the untrained eye sees no problem. And indeed, if you Google Chun-Li and spinning bird kick, as I did, you find out that that is indeed her special move. You also learn that there's an instrumental Arctic Monkeys track entitled Chun-Li's Spinning Bird Kick, which includes only the phrase, "show us your special move," and then some laughter. I don't know if I can mount an argument that successfully incorporates the Arctic Monkeys, so I'll just leave you with that fun fact, and we'll move along to the next line. Sounds like a pretty big plot hole to me that the ultimate street fight is supposed to be won by a ragtag team helmed by Sonya Blade. No offense to Sonya stans. This is it. This is the line that took me a few read-throughs before I realized the genius. And I still needed a little prompting from Twitter screen caps to recognize it. But I'll read it again. Sounds like a pretty big plot hole to me that the ultimate street fight is supposed to be won by a ragtag team helmed by Sonya Blade. No offense to Sonya stans. She just comes right out and says it. She says street fight. It's right there. Let me borrow the words of a great thinker from, of all places, Tumblr.com, publishing under the username Kendall Roy. When your English teacher asks you to explain why an author chose to use a specific metaphor or literary device, it is not because you won't be able to function in real-world society without the essential knowledge of Gatsby's green light or whatever. It's because that process develops your abilities to parse a text for meaning and fill in gaps in information by yourself. Continues further down. Instead of taking a piece of writing at face value and stopping there, assuming that there is no deeper meaning or thought behind the words on the page, ask yourself these two questions instead. 1, what is the author trying to say? And 2, what does the author maybe not realize they're saying? Because the most interesting reading of any piece of literature, IMHO, usually occupies the space in between those questions. From this, I encourage you to take the following. Rather than assuming that our author is an idiot savant who randomly plucked the words of the article out of thin air, perhaps we can consider that the inclusion of the word street fight in an article where a character from the game Street Fighter is found missing from an iteration of a similar but distinct series which does not include street fighting of any sort, and certainly not in its cinematic trailer, might we perhaps instead consider the possibility that she knows? She's known the whole time and has constructed a piece of prose that reflects that knowledge. Perhaps it is not she who worked too quickly and without sufficient care, but instead it was her audience, and specifically Twitter, who skimmed and went straight into complaining, who were overly hasty and negligent in their attention to detail. And then we have the last paragraph. It's made up mostly of the following sentence. Absence of Chun-Li aside, the trailer is the dog's bollocks, a term I learned from watching The Bridge, also on HBO Max, if you're into competition shows. And the extremely bloody, action-packed film, which is a super realistic study on the cross-section of kung fu and elemental magic, will premiere on April 16th. And this is the point where if no other single clue was able to penetrate your fog of geek rage at someone mistakenly associating Chun-Li with Mortal Kombat, you should still have realized something was up. This was the point where I, completely devoid of knowledge about Mortal Kombat, the existence of Chun-Li and her lethal kicks, or Street Fighter, realized that this was a joke. And yes, well, the dog's bollocks was the first thing to really raise my eyebrows. It was the parenthetical where the penny finally dropped. For those who don't know, The Bridge is a Scandinavian show which looks at international cooperation between Sweden and Denmark on a murder case on the border, which forces detectives from each country to share jurisdiction. Fiction, of course. It also has an American remake, which takes place along the US-Mexico border, also called The Bridge. And there is a British-French version called The Tunnel. I find it somewhat unlikely that the Scandinavian show used the term the dog's bollocks, but even if that appears in the subtitles, the game is still up, because calling it a competition show is to laughably mischaracterize it, seeing as it's less the Great British Bake Off and more Wallander. But of course it's laughable, because we are, after all, having a laugh here. Selecting The Bridge also seemingly ties back into this idea, which has been in the background of this article the whole time. The idea that Scorsese brings up in his essay the worry about the kind of cinematic productions we're bringing forth into the world. There are at least 4 series with the premise, which I refer to as the bridge because I can't pronounce either the Swedish or the Danish word for that. I can't, I'm sorry. They're the 3 I listed before, and there's also a German-Austrian version as well. It seems like everywhere you look, you're getting the same premise redone over and over and over again, whether it's remaking The Lion King and Beauty and the Beast, or various resituated premises like The Good Doctor or Humans. And finally, as many people pointed out to those who were freaking out on Twitter, she does describe the film as a, quote, super realistic study on the cross-section of kung fu and elemental magic, unquote. I think it's safe to say that sincere evaluation of the cinematic tour de force that Mortal Kombat 2021 will undoubtedly prove itself to be was not the point of this article. So now we turn to the response the article garnered. In doing so, we will have to examine one final piece that was added to the text of the article itself. The final addition to the article reads, Update, 4:39 p.m. Jezebel has discovered the answer to our question about Chun-Li's erasure, and it is that Chun-Li is not part of the Mortal Kombat megaverse. Wow! Now, obviously, given everything we have just said about the actual contents of the article, I sincerely hope that you, my lovely audience, has figured out that this phrase is dripping with insincerity. The final wow is painful in its mocking tone. But that's not actually the thing that makes this edition stand out. In keeping with traditional journalistic style guides, when Jezebel issues a correction to one of their stories, it either begins with a literally bold correction, and or the rest of the correction is typeset differently from the article itself. On their more extensive pieces, their corrections usually end with Jezebel regrets the error. Again, this is in keeping with standard journalistic practice, largely because it is important to highlight when a correction has been issued to draw attention to it, because that is how you maintain any semblance of integrity. We'll get into that in a little bit. In a long-form piece online, you tend to republish the article with the correction in place in the text of the article, which means that the article is usually by that point correct in its main text, and the correction is there just to let people know that a previous version of the article contained an error. This is one of the reasons that you need to include the date and time you accessed a web page when citing it, because the contents of the web page is subject to change. This now brings us to the way this so-called correction is structured. First of all, it's not actually a correction. It's an update. Now, you might say, that's a stupid, minuscule quibble. Don't they amount to the same thing? Well, no. Shockingly enough, words do mean things specifically, So when you are explaining that what you said before was incorrect and are attempting to correct the record, you issue a correction. When someone doesn't understand your joke, however, you don't usually rescind the entire thing. Furthermore, this update includes a timestamp. We know the article was published at 4:20 p.m., and this update was inserted at 4:39 p.m., 19 minutes later. And this is where the notion that this entire article was a piece of performance art intended to highlight the absurdity of fan culture and the ongoing hostility towards female writers in male-dominated fan spaces becomes clear. The first comment on the article was posted at 4:26 p.m. and reads, "Wasn't she not in the 90s movies as well? What do they have against the Queen?" What interests me more is the response to that comment at 4:30 p.m., where an individual responded that she's not from the games this series is about, different series made by a completely different company. That same person went on to add their own separate comment, a new comment thread, at 4:34 p.m., which reads, I can never tell when Jezebel is making joke posts. Mortal Kombat does not equal Street Fighter. I can understand why the distinction seems a bit left Twix versus right Twix factory to people who aren't gamers. I'm not really a fighting game person myself, TBH. But I did double check and confirm that they are completely different franchises developed and distributed by completely different companies. This is sort of like asking why Captain Picard never showed up in the new Star Wars trilogy, or why Wilson from Home Improvement never gave any sage advice to Hal Wilkerson, or why George Clooney's Doug Ross never showed up on Grey's Anatomy. And I would like to point out that somebody responded to the George Clooney portion with a gif of Sub-Zero ripping Sonya's spine out, the iconic killer move of Sub-Zero from Mortal Kombat, which I can only imagine was intended to showcase how this gamer guy totally owned this woman using a, daytime soap opera doctor drama reference. I don't know. I don't watch ER. I've never seen Grey's Anatomy. I do know who George Clooney is, but that's not really what we're talking about right now. But later on in this comment thread, we encounter the first incidents of one of the most disturbing aspects of this debacle. Someone posts saying, "I was pretty sure this was a joke until the update. Now, I'm still not sure." So, here's the thing. Updates and corrections aren't exempt from close reading. They are both just as capable of being erroneous as the body of an article. People have had to post corrections to corrections. It's always embarrassing when it happens, but it does happen. And because they are still a stylistic convention, they can be used to further a satirical piece of writing. The punchline is usually still considered part of the joke, and that's what this is, a punchline. And I would like to add, the sentence at the end of the article isn't a correction. To understand what someone is saying, you do actually have to pay attention to the details. But it genuinely concerns me that people are willing to accept that not only did this entire article make it through the phases of pitching, being accepted, being written, being edited, and posted with this kind of an enormous error, but that they're also willing to accept any kind of half-assed pseudo mea culpa as proof of their own superiority. By showing yourself unable to conceive of this being a joke, you have to truly believe that the people around you are so utterly beneath your dazzling superior intellect that you cannot conceive of them making a joke. But there's more to it than just this disconnect between styles of humor. After all, you're not required to think that a joke is funny, but bare minimum, you should be able to realize when it is actually a joke. And no, I don't mean that you can paper over any kind of rude, demeaning, or damaging rhetoric with "it was a joke." But you do need to ask yourself, is anyone really getting hurt if they think for a total of 5 minutes that Chun-Li should have been in the Mortal Kombat movie? What was particularly disturbing and distressing about the response to this article were the number of people who came out to specifically attack Jezebel for its feminist or woman-centered interests and its inability to cover video games properly. There were accusations that Jezebel was actively hurting the women who are fighting the good fight to be taken seriously in the realm of video game and action movie criticism, despite their disadvantage of being, female identified. Gamergate has left its indelible mark on the public consciousness that regularly deals with geek cultural criticism. And what this debacle has proven is counter to the hopeful prevailing narrative that we've made progress and are more accepting of diverse voices in the realms of geek criticism. What I saw in the replies were legions of female critics doing their best pick-me impressions, saying that not all female cultural critics are like this. That's not progress. That's allowing the narrow definitions of what cultural criticism can be to continue to be defined by the same kind of people who doxed and tormented female critics in 2014. Because not a single person seems to have bothered to notice the other ideas and influences which were woven into this article. Not one person commented about Martin Scorsese. And finally, I want to talk about some things that are very close to my heart. I want to talk to you about criticism, and I want to talk to you about journalism. Both of these things can appear in newspapers or on news websites or other publications of that sort. But they are not equal. Nor are they in any way ideologically or functionally the same. Many, many, many people replied with comments like, "This wasn't labeled as satire," or "Jezebel is undermining their serious journalism by posting this stuff without declaring it as being different from their serious pieces." But the truth is, not all articles are created equal. we separate out various topics from one another, be it into politics, arts and culture, business, and sports sections, and we do it for both practical and ideological reasons. Some people want to know what the scores are more than they want to know whether or not we're making progress in limiting Iran's nuclear capabilities. But notice that nuclear proliferation gets to be close to the front page of the paper or the website, and that the sports coverage is further in. That's because we have established standards within journalism which, at a fundamental level, prioritize nuclear weapons and large-scale humanitarian disasters over whether or not the Knicks won. And one of the ways we evaluate how important a story is can be recognized by where it's situated in a publication. When there is a scandal involving sports coaches abusing their players, that often moves the story out of the sports section of the paper and into the news and politics section. An article which is commenting on the state or quality of the live-action Mortal Kombat movie is just not as important as the coverage Jezebel may provide on issues relating to reproductive health or the work they publish on The Slot, which is their political news coverage section. Furthermore, on political issues or other traditionally newsworthy topics, we expect a standard of journalistic integrity, which is often referred to as, quote-unquote, being objective. Now, I don't believe that any human being or piece of writing can ever truly be objective. But I do believe that it is the responsibility of the journalist to cover topics with as much depth, breadth, and accuracy to both the facts and the people involved, so as to enable the person who is either reading the story or watching the news coverage to understand a given situation and form their own opinion on it. By contrast, when I read a movie or a book review, I expect nothing like that same level of even-handedness. I expect the reviewer to give me an assessment of the work, drawing not only on their personal experiences of the work in question, but also their cultural and historical knowledge as it relates to the subject matter or the genre or the production. And I want their further insight as someone with significant experience with the material in question. That is, I prefer to have Martin Scorsese tell me about Fellini. I don't have to agree with Martin Scorsese and their assessments of the subject matters in question. But Scorsese can tell me things about Fellini that I likely would not otherwise know or be able to recognize. There are reviewers that I read purely because I know that any film they hate, I will enjoy. To claim that an article on Mortal Kombat 2021 should in any way be considered on par in terms of importance or value with what might otherwise be called real journalism merely reveals that you are unable to critically engage with different types of information. And just in case anyone cares, Jezebel isn't really a real news website. The bulk of their articles are aggregate reporting, which means that they are pulling from first-person coverage provided by other journalistic outlets, because Jezebel tends to be more liberal or left-leaning, socially progressive. They usually draw from the New York Times and the Washington Post. And then they present their own personal and often ironic or flippant spin. If you're worried that Jezebel will undermine their journalistic integrity with a sarcastic piece about Mortal Kombat, I'm worried about what you think journalistic integrity even is. Well, there you have it. This is a significant portion of your life that you will never get back. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you are now more ready to engage critically with the written word. And I'll see you around. Thanks.